The history itself is a product of the times in which it was written, and so it lacks veracity, or it lacks truth.
If you put 5 of the best reporters in the country on any scene, you're going to read 5 very different stories.
If we knew about Lewis Redmond in western North Carolina, it has been forgotten. But he is vividly alive in South Carolina, particularly around Oconee and Walhalla. They still tell stories about him. Of course, like all folk heroes, half of them aren't true. Fabulous stories of things that he did. But the truth is strange enough, believe me.
He was a folk hero like no other in our part of the country.
Lewis Redmond was a name I did not know until I was around 20, 21 years old. And I grew up in this area, took South Carolina history, and should have known the name. And an uncle happened to mention him, and I started asking him details, and then realized that Lewis Redmond is my great-great-grandfather. I eventually found out about half of what I had originally found out was true.
Evening, folks. I am Lewis Redmond, murderer, bootlegger, thief. At least those are charges against me. I'd never heard of Lewis Redmond, honestly, and I never realized that he was such a famous outlaw as he was at that time. But I think a lot of the old tales and the stuff after the Civil War that didn't just get passed on by word of mouth, it's untelling at the characters that we have lost and won't ever know anything about them, like Lewis Redmond.
He was very much a product of his time and place. This was at the end of Reconstruction, when the South had nothing and the people up in the mountain South had even less. They had lost so many of their men in the war, men from 12 years old to 80, practically everybody that could make a living was dead or crippled. And they started out with nothing to begin with.
The worst thing about the Civil War wasn't the war itself, as far as the mountains was concerned. It was the Reconstruction period afterwards. People would just load up in the night and leave a farm that had been in the family for years and go to town and work in the textile plant. Speculators moved in and started buying up the land, and in a time when many people said bootleg or perish, they made moonshine.
It was just an absolute necessity for survival. They had a saying back then, here's the old corn liquor, whitens the teeth, perfumes the breath, and makes childbirth a pleasure.
So it was a different time. It's hard to judge what that fella thought he had to do in those years to feed those children. People needed that money, and they needed to buy groceries, and needed to pay their taxes.
Lewis inadvertently became a force for good in that he provided poor mountain farmers with a way to pay their taxes. They could moonshine. If they'd make the liquor and pass it to him, he would sell it. And he had an awesome moonshine ring that ran up out of Oconee, up through Toxaway and over into Buncombe County and through Jackson, and then back down into North Georgia. And it was an awesome operation.
And when Lewis would go pay your property taxes so the carpetbaggers wouldn't get it, that made him a hero. And he did this kind of thing. Fed the widows, stuff like that,
They brought in guns and they ran them down and they had gun battles. It was a very, very rough time because these moonshiners, they felt that it was their inalienable right. It was their land and their corn and their product, and they just saw no reason why they should pay taxes on it. They never had paid taxes on it before.
I tend to go with the South Carolina people who perceive revenuers as the scum of the earth, because they were. frequently the government hired people, many instances, they were still in jail. People with criminal backgrounds, they thought that they would make good revenuers, and there's a certain logic in that.
Redmond himself had started working on his dad's steel when he was a young age and transporting some whiskey, and like many people, there was a warrant out for him. The revenuers raided his home. His mother was ill in bed, and he said the fright killed her a couple of days later. They arrested his father. Redmond wasn't at home at the time.
And old man Redmond was so apparently mistreated in jail that he died. Lewis was left with the girls because the two older boys had both been killed in the Civil War that he had to provide for.
The one event that changed his life happened on a back road in the mountains.
One of Lewis's childhood friends that he had played with became a federal marshal.
Duckworth pulled a warrant out with somebody else's name on it.
He was bluffing, of course. He was trying his damnedest to get Redmond to submit to being arrested. And he was going to walk him down the road in front of the world with that gun to jail. And Lewis was not going.
So he just made a spur of the moment decision of what to do and shot him through the throat.
Hit Al in the throat. I seen his collar button vanished. Blood just wailed out.
So Redmond in that instant goes from typical mountain moonshiner to having killed a federal marshal.
Officers who were sent to capture him had a very frustrating time because local farmers lied to them and protected Lewis.
One of Redmond's most famous escapades took place when he was eventually actually set up. Redmond and his partner friend Amos Ladd arrived at the cabin. Door bursts open, a posse of about 4 or 5 come in. He manages to escape and comes back and waits in ambush for them. As they come down with Amos still in custody, he shoots one of them, and in the mayhem, Amos escapes. So now Redmond is mad, not because they got the whiskey, but because they took his money and his horses. So he goes to the marshal's home, captures him. Marshal says, "We deposited the money in a bank in Greenville." And Redmond says, "Well, let's go write a check." So he accompanies the marshal's wife on horseback. She writes a check, and he says after talking to her, they were in dire straits. You know, their kids were a little bit hungry, so I told them to keep some of the money.
He was courting Adeline Ladd, the sister of his Confederate Amos Ladd, who was a teenager. They were both young. In the middle of all of this, a bunch of the detractors came to the Ladd's house.
They came up on the porch. One of them knocked on the door, and the rest of them were already armed. And when that man opened the door, they blew him away.
His mother grabbed him and held him while he died. And they were saying, "Redmond, we got you, we got you." Well, it wasn't Lewis, it was Amos.
There are even versions where it didn't happen in the house, it happened outside. The man was returning to the house and turned around in the doorway and they shot him. And finally, all we have is Redmond's version, Amos Ladd's mother and his sister's version, and as near as I can tell, the revenuers aren't talking. They did later. They had to testify in court, and they claimed that he drew first. You know, that not only did he draw first, his gun misfired.
The jury was out for 35 minutes and came back not guilty. And that just added to the sense that there's nothing we can do. The law not only is persecuting us, but will not help us at all, which again led to more, we're going to have to do this outside. And who's leading the charge outside? Major Redmond. He became the people's champion.
Appalachia has a history of being victimized by outside interests, and in every indication that I find, the government is always connected with it. The government endorsed what the timber people did, and then in came the mineral people and the coal mines, and so at the present time even, if you're dealing with a true native of the mountains, you will find that he is very suspicious of what he calls the outsider, the outlander. Sometimes they call them missionaries, and it has nothing to do with religion. It's people who come here to help us. And so it has bred a skepticism and an antagonism for outsiders, and the government in particular, because time and time again they've been victimized by forces beyond their control, and usually they were forces that had government sanction.
This tradition of the outlaw was ingrained with the Irish. That played into Redmond's ascendancy into folk hero status. Suddenly, Redmond becomes a national celebrity, on the run in the mountains, flaunting federal authority. Redmond was called the most notorious outlaw in America. To a lot of the Southern papers at the time, he was the quintessential Southerner who was fighting the Yankees, fighting federal power. In the Northern papers at the time, he was a scofflaw who was fighting federal power.
See, the New York paper would describe him as malevolent, leering, bestial, walked with a slump and leered.
Now let me see if I can't put that all together.
And you turn around and read a description of him in, say, Arthur's History, and he is dark, raven black hair, strikingly handsome, walks and moves like a panther. You know, remarkable difference.
You have various accounts of him from the Northern papers, the Southern papers, and then you have the almost completely fictitious dime novels that were written about him. In one in particular, he was described as having long flowing golden curls and wore the bandoliers and, you know, a double brace of pistols and was rescuing fair maidens. He had attended Princeton and spent time in Europe. You have essentially popular opinion trying to put its stamp of how it wants to see him. And at the heart you have this mountain farmer who I think would rather be left alone.
I find a lot of references in South Carolina newspapers that the notorious outlaw Redmond has retreated to North Carolina and is somewhere in Jackson County. And it's interesting that Jackson County retains no memory of him at all. And of course then I met Opal, which made no sense at all. I was in a grocery store. Opal came up and said, "Are you the feller that has been writing about the outlaw?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, I think I'm related to him." And I said, "No kidding." She said, "I think so. We was raised to not talk about it, but I think that we was." And I said, "Well, ma'am, if you don't mind telling me, do you have any idea where he lived? I never have been able to figure out where he lived." She says, "Well, of course I know where he lived. He lived at the King place. Silver Watershed's up there, and that's where John King lived." And then she looked at me and said, "Who's a relative of yours?" One of the Kings married Lewis Redmond's sister, Maddie, and he come to live up there.
Well, Maddie Redmond was my great-grandma. She married a king. I read his story, and she couldn't find where he stayed at. And I saw him at Walmart one day, and I told him I knew where he stayed.
You go up Fisher Creek or Dill's Cove?
You go up Fisher Creek, and then you turn to your left up there. It's where the Dill's water starts up Dill's head of that mountain up there.
Here we are driving on a paved road into a section that, my God, there wasn't even a trail, a dirt trail or nothing. This was pure wilderness up here.
When you get into the research of somebody, you keep searching for more and more. And it gets to be like wanting food or something else. You get into it and you don't want to quit.
Oh, there's the water system. I'll be damned. See, over there's the big wheel. Lewis Redmond, the outlaw that I've been writing about, lived here. And to him, of course, it was paradise. It looked like an ideal place to make moonshine. And he apparently did so for several years. His sister Mattie had married a king, and they lived here in this section, which is about as remote as you can get.
And I told the boys that I figured it was time we went on the offensive. And we saddled up and we rode back into town, and on the way we run into that posse and we run.
I found in writing about Redmond that I did not create fictitious events in order to enrich or make Redmond more interesting. If anything, I had to muffle it down. I had to buffer it, because the truth is so unbelievable, you would think I made it up.
Yeah, I think he was a whole lot meaner guy than we actually portray him being, because they said he hit out and shot a guy off a horse as he rode by, and we don't have any of that in the play. I think we kind of mellowed him up a little more than he really was.
He was giving hope to a lot of people that the law might not be on our side, but Redmond is fighting for us. And not fighting in Congress, he is actually fighting. He is shot and being shot at.
During all this, he sent out notices to everybody that he was getting married. And he and Adeline had this wedding, and then they disappeared. And they disappeared up the Little Tennessee River into North Carolina, into what's now the bottom of Fontana Lake. Well, one morning he was out hoeing his cornfield early, and here came the federal boys.
Several variations saying that he started firing immediately. Some say that the posse didn't even give him warning, that they just started shooting. In the end, though, he was hit.
And according to whose account you believe, he was shot either 20 times or 50-something times.
They shot him 13 times.
I mean, to be shot 6 times as he was in Bryson City, and I think that's probably the accurate number. It got up to 14. There's even a version where his lungs were hanging out of his chest.
They left him for dead out there lying between his corn rows. She heard the shooting and ran out there, and they retreated. They didn't even stay to take the body.
And I had already written his epitaph and even had his death words in the paper. I'm sorry. Sorry. I regret my shameful life. Boom.
When he was reported to have died, the New York Times covered that front page. Several months later, when Billy the Kid died, that was a paragraph on page 8. Redmond probably made the biggest mistake a potential folk hero could make. As he is lying there bleeding from 13 wounds among the corn rows, he survived.
Jesse James is famous. There's been hundreds of books written about Jesse James. There's been movies written about Jesse James. People still argue and debate about Jesse James. Was he a vicious psychopath, or was he a man trapped by history, blah, 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 blah. They don't do that about Redmond. Why? He did not die the way a hero dies. If he had gone out in a blaze of glory, shot to death, if he had died that day in Bryson City when they shot him, we would still be talking about him.
If he had died in that cornfield, he would have outshined Billy the Kid today.
He was near death for a while, but they nursed him back to health and eventually put him on trial, and he was sentenced to a total of 10 years in prison and $2,600 in fines. Then Senator Wade Hampton of South Carolina, who had been governor before, is pushing for a pardon. South Carolina governor at the time is pushing for a pardon. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was pushing for a pardon. After 21 months or so, he was transferred to the state penitentiary in South Carolina, spent just a couple of days there because presidential pardon from Chester A. Arthur came through. And I always tell my students when I start talking about Chester Arthur that he's my favorite president, because if he hadn't pardoned my great-great-grandfather, I might not be here today.
This is the pardon that Chester Arthur, then the president, gave to Lewis Redmond to get him out of the federal pen in Auburn, New York. This is so beautiful. This is beautiful. I could not imagine anything like this happening today.
I think Wade Hampton admired Lewis Redmond, and I think that he admired bootleggers or moonshine people who saved their lands and persisted by practicing what was an illegal act the federal government said was against the law. He represented an aspect of South Carolina history that did not fare well if you tried to defend it nationally or to the federal government, but he knew this man deserved a pardon.
It was reported that Wade Hampton, the governor, and many well-wishers and admirers met him at the train station. Every time the train would stop somewhere along the way, people would get on just to shake his hand.
There was this huge entourage of officials down there, state politicians and everybody, to greet him and deliver him into the arms of Adeline and the children.
The next unusual thing that happened after he's been on the run from the government, nationally on outlaw prison, federal pardon, was that there was a government distillery in Walhalla, South Carolina. The foreman contacts Redmond and said, would you like to come be the overseer of the government manufactured whiskey? And Redmond did.
He made gobs of money for the state of South Carolina or for Dietrich Beeman or whoever got the money, you know, by putting his picture on the bottles and the kegs and everything with whiskey. It was Lewis Redmond's, you know, prime product. So it thrived during that period where he lived happily till he died. He's still pretty young. He was in his 50s when he died in 1906.
He was many things to many people. He was an outlaw, he was a husband, he was a farmer, he was a moonshiner, he was a foreman of a whiskey distillery. But his family did have the last word. On his tombstone is engraved, he was the sunshine of our home. I think that may be a clear indication of who he was.